Hello, friends. Today we are discussing the situation in Syria. And in the beginning, let me give you a summary of what is happening now and what has happened in Syria since 2015, including Russian campaign in Syria. So what is happening right now? In the past months or so, there has been a very unusual high-profile escalation on all fronts in Syria. And this, we know, is not so much dependent on what so-called ISIS, quote-unquote, is doing, because ISIS, as I'll tell you later, consists of different factions, and it's not uniform, it's not homogeneous, it is really hodgepodge of everything. We assign this name ISIS or ISIL to huge variety of various factions who are fighting between themselves, with Assad, against the world, basically, where terrorists are coming from to threaten the rest of the world, where militants are coming from. And why that is happening, we'll talk about later. So the escalations are not, surprisingly for some, dependent on what ISIS is doing, because Russia has dealt with ISIS in the past 2.5 years approximately, from 2015 till 2017. And as we know, Putin declared victory. Well, he called it a relative or intermediary victory. There's still a lot to be done, he said, and I agree with that. So Russian campaign was hugely successful, as we well know. So successful, in fact, that people's jaws dropped, actually. And in the West, they never expected such a great result in such a short of a time. Very briefly, what Russia has done ever since in 2015, Assad invited officially Russian troops into Syria, was to liberate about 70% of Syrian territory. When Assad first sent this urgent and desperate plea to Putin to send troops to Syria, at that time, Assad only controlled about 10% of the entire territory of Syria. And now it's up to about 70% of the territory. It is this unbelievable, huge result. Basically, ISIS, or that conglomeration of troops that were the scare of the civilized world, and which USA pretended to fight against for a while, and of course instead they were arming them, that ISIS stopped existing. There is no Islamic State anymore. This is officially admitted by everyone fact, and that's also the result of Russia's campaign. Assad, of course, is still there. Nothing happened to Assad. Syria is starting to rebuild, although of course all kinds of situations, all kinds of attacks continue happening still. But what has been accomplished is unbelievable. So many cities have been liberated, and very successfully, very carefully, very minimal loss to the civilian population, although those losses are unfortunately unavoidable. The majority, as a matter of fact, ISIS presently, or anybody who is fighting under that umbrella, doesn't have a single city. All cities in Syria were liberated from them. They do not have a stronghold in a single city. What does that mean? They have to hide out in compromised locations. And those compromised locations, because they don't have the protection of city walls, where one can hide very successfully, from where one can actually use civilians as a human shield. If you are out of cities, you are in the desert, you have to either dig into the ground, which of course they do very well in the Middle East, as a matter of fact. This is one of their specialties, dig deep into the ground, dig tunnels. But in addition to that, you have to be in a specific territory. And Russians agreed to that kind of reconciliation territory, which is supposed to be under the Turkish supervision, and that we will also discuss. Also, the peace process, really big-time peace process, started in Syria, something that was inconceivable just a year or two ago. And this peace process we will also talk about in this report, and it's happening in Russian Sochi and in Kazakhstan Astana. So the West has been effectively completely booted out of the entire spread in Syria. And what is Syria? Syria is the key to the entire Middle East And Syria has the potential to ignite a new world war if not handled carefully, because so many interests are clashing there. And so I will proceed to the new escalations. And we have had huge escalations in the past month and a half approximately, and they were between Iran and Israel on Syrian territory. There were US, Kurds, and Turkey, that triangle also on Syrian territory. Turkey has invaded Syria, began an incursion into Syria. And above all this, there is one czar, new czar of the Middle East. You all recall my interview that I gave to The Plain Truth a couple of months ago. And in that interview, we talked about the new czar of the Middle East that arrived. That's Putin, and that's Russia. So Russia is that ultimate mediator. Russia has gained tremendous influence in the Middle East that only the Soviet Union possessed in its heyday. And ever since the Soviet Union collapsed and Russia withdrew from everywhere, Putin, from year 2000, 2001 and onward, has been rebuilding painstakingly, step by step, Russian influence everywhere, inside the country and all over the world. And we see a humongous change, humongous earth shift happening in the Middle East right now, when Russia is gaining power and influence by leaps and bounds, and USA is losing it. And I will give you an unrelated to Syria example of what happened recently, but it is directly related to Syria when you think about it. Recently, Mahmoud Abbas, who is the head of the Palestinian autonomy, came to Moscow to beg Putin to become the #1 mediator in the conflict between Palestine and Israel. Abbas stated officially for the whole world to hear that they do not trust US anymore. They do not want US there. They don't want to talk to them, because what was happening previously? USA was the lead mediator in all those negotiations that have been going on and on and on for many years after the Soviet Union withdrew, after collapsing, and Russia withdrew from the process. Before that, Russia, as the Soviet Union, participated in all those processes one way or the other, and not a single thing could have been signed, or not a single deal could have been made in the Middle East without Russian participation, as far as peace negotiations go, as far as different political shenanigans this way and that way. And so after the Soviet Union collapsed and withdrew, and of course that weakening process was happening for some time after Brezhnev died, and the Soviet Union started going into this identity crisis, let's just say, in the 80s. But ultimately the 90s were a total disaster, total withdrawal for Russia from everywhere. So now what is happening is that more and more countries in the Middle East and beyond actually are asking for USA's withdrawal. Well, so far they're doing it very mildly, because USA still possess the largest and supposedly most potent army in the world, and way too much political and especially economic and financial pressure that US can put on anybody that they wish at any given moment. So I said supposedly military power, because we really, truly, honestly don't know the true capacity of the US Army in combat. We know the Russian Army capacity in combat because they've been so successful in Syria. They have proven it. Well, why Russia went to Syria? It's several factors at once. This really happened after USA took over Ukraine. If that did not happen in 2013, Russia may have not gone to Syria. But this mixed bag, good and bad, actually resulted in amazingly great results. Russian self-identification started reforming. They started remembering who they really are. And that's thanks to both the adverse events in Ukraine and Russia's victory in Syria. Putin declared this intermediary preliminary victory. The major operation, he said, by the Russian troops has ended in the end of 2017, and a lot of troops have been withdrawn. What happened as a result, though? Russia acquired 2 major, very important naval bases, air force bases in Syria. And Assad is very grateful to Russia. He came to Putin, was hugging him with tears in his eyes, and was promising whatever Russia wants in Syria, Russia has the first pick. Having two bases in the Mediterranean, something Soviet Union lost still during Soviet days. They still had some bases there in Egypt, and in earlier days there was also a base in Albania, but Russians were kind of leaving everywhere, and that started even during the Soviet Union. And so that waning of the Soviet Union, of course, was gradual throughout the 80s, and some of it started even earlier. Meanwhile, USA was moving into the Mediterranean with its bases, and there are plenty of those. So these two bases completely negate USA's advantage in the Mediterranean. This is a complete annihilation of any advantage. You have to understand the Mediterranean, the Middle East, this is the heart of the world. This is the geographic center of the world. If you show that map, if you look at the map of the world, that is shown not as a globe, but as the entire spread out map, as a picture, you will see that Mediterranean and the Middle East are the heart, the center of the world. Whatever happens in those areas, this is the key to everything else, geopolitically speaking. Well, Black Sea also plays into that. This is why Crimea, Odessa, this is why I talk about those regions so much, and southern Ukraine, southern Russia, all that also plays into all this, together with the Middle East and Mediterranean. And Russia acquiring those two bases and securing that stronghold in Syria, that's absolutely priceless. This completely changes the whole outlook for the Mediterranean and for the Middle East. And this is why Abbas came to Putin asking Russia to step in as lead negotiator and mediator in the crisis between Palestinians and Israel. And this is why other countries, there has been a pilgrimage to Putin, to Moscow, to see Lavrov, to the Kremlin, to Sochi, from the Middle East. And we have leaders of countries that never came to Russia before, nor the Soviet Union, such as Saudi king, for example, such as huge Qatari delegation, with all of them basically bowing to new Tsar. Netanyahu, who is calling Putin and visiting Putin several times a year. There are visits from Netanyahu and Israeli ministers to Russia, and constant calls back and forth. This never happened. This could not have been imagined even 5 years ago, even 3 years ago, as a matter of fact. But it especially could not have been imagined when the Soviet Union was there, because the divisions, this I want you to hear out very, very well, the new quality of Russian participation and Russian return to the Middle East. What is it about? It's about the fact that Russia is that peacemaker. Russia has reverted to its core role of the global great balancer that balances everybody and can get along with everybody. This never happened with the USSR, because the USSR versus USA, two polarities. So Russia appealed to one group while USA appealed to the opposite group. And that's how they balanced each other. That's how balancing act was, very flawed balancing act was performed when there were two superpowers. That's from 1945 till 1991. Then, of course, this whole balancing act collapsed, and now we are building throughout this great shift the new balancing act, and Russia, the great balancer, reverts to her original role, and everywhere, not just in the Middle East. Of course, there are helpers. This is not the focus of this report, and I will continue talking about it. Those of you who really want to know what's happening, please subscribe to my new Patreon subscription, which is where I will be talking very much in detail, revealing secrets. I already said that to my Patreon patrons. I'm shifting all of my very serious content to Patreon, the most serious analytical predictionary content there. And of course, I'll be publishing books. I'll be doing more webinars. But as far as Earthshift reports are concerned, because there are so many projects going on, this might be one of my last Earthshift reports, folks. So if you are interested in my work, Patreon is the place to be. And we are starting new things on Future Strandcast, of course, but it's going to be more of a cooperative effort. So back to Syria and Russia in Syria. So Syria is such a key for everything that is happening, key for the earth shift. Russia has forgotten for a while how to be a great balancer, the real, true, karmic, historic destiny of Russia, to be that balancing act for the world, but without sacrificing their own interests. And that's what was not happening with the USSR. With the present day Russia, with Putin at the helm, it is starting to happen seriously. Absolutely different quality of Russian participation. Everybody recognizes that Russia is the only country, pay attention here, the only country in the Middle East who can talk to every party and who is friendly to every party and with whom every single party there can talk and wants to talk. That includes most of Syrian opposition. And we will talk about that later. And the peace process that is developing in Astana and in Sochi. So here we are. These are the results. These are the intermediate results, as a matter of fact. We are not there yet. But can you imagine how impressive those intermediate results are? So Russia restored so much by going into Syria. Not only they saved Syria, well, and ensure the continuity of the process in Syria. Assad is still there. Democracy is coming to Syria. Assad, for the first time, agreed to elections. There is a dialogue that is going on between him and opposition groups and parties under Russian mediation in Sochi and under Russian and Kazakh mediation in Astana. This is unheard of, absolutely unheard of results for 2.5 years of participation. Meanwhile, we know there was a complete fail by the US, of course, intentional fail, because US and the West wanted to bring more mayhem through the Middle East and wanted to break up and create this fire in the Middle East that cannot be extinguished through Syria, through Iraq, through Afghanistan, etc. Of course, there is a direct correlation between Syria and Russian elections. As a result of Syrian victories, Putin's ratings went through the roof. And we know for a fact he will win by a landslide during this upcoming Russian election on March 18th, 2018. But you know, I wanted to prepare a separate report about this and tell you all about Putin, his plans, my predictions, his rivals, and the whole spread. And this report will only come out if I get 50 subscribers or more by early March on Patreon. So it's up to you guys. If you want this report, then you really need to follow me on Patreon. Then go to my Patreon page and see if this is for you. Now, what is happening though is that when it was seen that all this is happening and Russian elections result are being even solidified and Putin's win is solidified as a result of Syria victories and how Russia exited Syria, the other side, the dark side, let's call it collectively, started interfering and creating escalations. And when I say collective dark side, oh my goodness, I don't just mean US or a dark state or the West in general. I mean ISIS as well. So there are these umbrella of the dark state, let's just call it, which is causing these escalations. And we will discuss all this throughout this report. This is why these escalations are happening right before Russian elections. And there are lots of them. And that's why many of you ask me these questions. What is really going on in Syria? And they concern not just ISIS, as I mentioned previously, they concern world powers. They concern superpowers. And they concern major regional powers. We are going to be talking in this report about Iran, Israel. We're going to be talking about Turkey. We're going to be talking about the Kurds and the remnants of ISIS, maybe I'll mention, but they're not even relevant. And we will be talking about USA and Russia. And to top it off, we'll even mention China and a little bit about the EU. All this is happening in this Syrian front, where everybody and anybody you can think of who has any interest in the region, who has any power, any sway in the region, is like piling up, and everybody is seemingly trying to carve up a piece of action. Let's see what this is about.